Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm actually in Maine at the moment. It's cold and rainy and just about freezing outside. I take it it's not the same temperature in Arizona at the moment. As Norm says, I'm a landscape historian. And as a historian, I'm interested in how people both use and think about the landscapes that they live in or visit and the associated resources that sit within those landscapes. Different people ascribe different values to lands, and they choose those values or they adopt those values as a function of their own cultural, social, and economic experiences. Water, of course, is one of those associated resources, and perhaps in our deserts, the most important one. I love this quote, but Mark Twain once said that whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting. And that is still so true in our desert environments today. Agua Caliente Spring, which is the topic of our talk tonight, is a park in Tucson, Arizona. It has been many things to many people over the last 150 years, all because of water. And as you know, that's a rare commodity in our desert landscapes. The story that I'm going to tell tonight is a cautionary tale about how conflict arises from differences in individual perceptions and how these differences play out in the protection and preservation of our culturally important places and their resources. A well-known geographer named Donald Meinig once wrote a brilliant little essay entitled "The Beholding Eye." Meinig posits a thought experiment. He places 10 individuals upon a hill and asks each to describe that same landscape. Each viewer interprets his vision according to his or her own beliefs, hopes, and values. A civil engineer sees soil types and topography, challenges and opportunities for construction. Ansel Adams, on the other hand, would remark on the grandeur of the view. The ecologist discerns patterns of natural resources, important ecological zones for plants and animals. A painter, on the other hand, would appreciate the aesthetic qualities of the scenery, color, texture, the beauty of a winding road that disappears in the distance. Anyway, you get the picture. As Meinig explains, the landscape is not what lies before our eyes, but what lies within our heads and our hearts. So keep that thought in mind as I continue this story. In Tucson, as elsewhere in the desert Southwest, are associated with high value natural resources. Our archaeological sites, traditional cultural places, and historic landscapes are situated near important perennial streams, rivers, or springs. That prehistoric, historic, and modern availability of water has defined where habitation sites have supported humans, livestock, and agriculture. So it's important to understand that water is not only valuable in and of itself, but for what it inspires and creates around it. So my description is apt for Agua Caliente, which sits in the northeast corner of the Tucson Basin. It has, or had, 2 springs that fed this beautiful spot. One was hot, one was cold, and they both emerged from the same location. The earliest measurement of flow out of those springs was 500 gallons per minute, a remarkable quantity that's hard to envision today. Agua Caliente hosted a medium-sized prehistoric settlement in Archaic and Hohokam periods. Fort Lowell military troops used it as a temporary encampment. The spring with its land was claimed by as many as 20 different owners over time. They recognized the value of this remarkable resource in an otherwise barren desert. They saw development opportunities for cattle ranching, early commercial farming, a hotel, and even a sanitarium. This was considered a place of healing and recreation. The last set of owners had plans for high-density residential development that, thank God, never came to fruition. And finally, in 1984, the property was purchased by PIMA County to become its first natural park. What is important to understand about Agua Caliente is that over the last 150 years, it has been viewed and used by the Tucson community and the local neighborhood as their public place of resort and recreation, even when that site was a private home. The site was cooler and shadier than downtown. Families could pay to visit and have picnics, come and camp on the weekends. Even for entire summers, people came to visit. They came to drink and bathe in those spring waters. This pattern of use and this sense of ownership has been passed down through generations of Tucsonans. It was recognized as what we call a traditional cultural place. So it was entirely fitting when Pima County acquired the site, Agua Caliente was returning to be a park for its people. The other point I want to point out at this point in time is that Agua Caliente is also a historic designed landscape. And you can see some of the components up on the screen at the moment. We'll go into them in more detail in a bit. Like all landscapes, its components have evolved through time. Some of them today are hard to see if you don't know where to look. Others have been intentionally left to return to a more natural state. And finally, some are still being maintained by Pima County. So the rest of my talk is going to cover 4 separate areas. I'm going to talk briefly about these resources that you see in front of you and their features. And then I'll give a brief history of the site and the changes that have occurred on the land. Both of these pieces will help you understand how the land and the water values have arisen over time. And then finally, I'll talk about the challenges involving community conflict over these different values and a resolution where now these values have become shared by both community and county today. It's important to remember that nothing present at Agua Caliente is natural anymore. All of these elements are man-made or man-manipulated, as it were. This is Agua Caliente Spring, now a pool that was developed in the 1870s. Again, the confluence of 2 springs, a cold and a hot one, that emerge at the same location and produce large amounts of water, or did produce large amounts of water. This is the channel that was once open and free-flowing, but now is overgrown with fan palms. It still feeds the ponds below it in a series of irrigation pipes. The main pond that we see today is really a reconstruction of two smaller ones. It has silted in over the 150 years and has been invaded by California fan palms, reeds, cattails, bulrushes, and a variety of non-native species of fish and amphibians, carp, bluegill, sunfish, snapping turtles, and worst of all, bullfrogs. The main pond was rebuilt and enhanced in 1963 with higher walls to hold more water. Parts of the landscape and the ranch house originate from the 1870s, but most of it, we believe, was constructed in around the 1920s, and we'll talk more about that later. Another pond called the irrigation pond, which was built in 1911, is now abandoned. It provides the septic tank that is important for visitors visiting the site. And finally, the old orange orchard and the agricultural fields that produce the hay for the ranch have been renaturalizing since the late 1950s and early 1960s. It's hard to see the remnants of some of those furrows. You can see the yellow arrows on the screen and the berms through the overgrown mesquites, but you can also identify them by the irrigation features in between them. That's our survey of the park and the land today. Unlike you as a visitor to this talk, most visitors to the park will never see or know about these features because they're not part of the common landscape, the public landscape of the park. However, these features record much of the real history of Agua Caliente and its past. Now for the history of this land. I've got two maps up in front of you. One is the earliest map of the Tucson Basin, done by a soldier from Fort Lowell in 1883. And the one below is 10 years later. It's the first county-wide map produced in Pima County. The inset at the upper right shows you a blow-up of what you see on the Fort Lowell map. And if I can find my cursor to get over there. There we go. As you can see, already in 1883, there is a road which is approaches Agua Caliente. Here's the origin of the spring. There are already 4 structures in 1883, and this line indicates a ditch which takes the water from the spring to the agricultural fields there. You can see in the 1893 map that Agua Caliente is already on a major road. People come and visit Agua Caliente already in droves at this point in time. Okay. In the late 1870s and 1880s, James Fuller and his family were the first to see Agua Caliente's possibilities for resort development. The historic maps I showed you indicate the importance of Agua Caliente already in the community. We believe that the previous owner dug the first pond here, for livestock irrigation. Fuller took that pond and began adding shade trees, shrubs, and flowers for beautification. Instead of a room with a view, how would you like a cabin in a pond? People would come and stay in this cabin and the ones elsewhere around the pond. It was much cooler than the hot temperatures of downtown Tucson, and it was beautified by these lovely trees that you see in the background. Those are cottonwoods. Oops, sorry. Cottonwoods and mesquites. Fuller harnessed that terrific flow of water to irrigate his agricultural fields. Here is the ditch that you see, that we saw on the map, that would take water to his agricultural fields below the pond. He planted orange trees, some of the first in Tucson, in the late 1870s. And he had a huge field in behind where he had vegetables growing, and even more, he had an early plant nursery that sold roses, all sorts of trees. James Fuller had big visions of what he could make out of Agua Caliente. Later owners built a second pond. You can see the north pond at the bottom of the screen. Whoever took the photograph is probably in a boat in the south pond, and there's the division in between. The green arrows mark the raised platform to walk to the island. That island no longer has its cabin on it, but it's still available for promenading. This south pond was considered the swimming pond. It was much deeper than the north pond. As you can see, lots of people came to visit and to swim in the pond, most of whom couldn't swim. And so you can see a lot of them holding on to boards that kept them afloat while they were in the pond. The pond was not only for refreshment, but one also for promenading, as you can see in the background. People came to see and to be seen at Agua Caliente. This is one of my favorite pictures. The picture is taken in 1914. The three individuals are probably there around the 4th of July. The man on the right is proudly holding the new flag with 48 stars. Arizona has just become formally a full state in the country. The man in the middle, if you can, and it may be hard to see, is holding a pewter goblet full of spring water, which he is offering to the man with the flag. People came to drink of this spring. At about this time, Agua Caliente is used as a health resort. The spring waters have been tested for mineral content, including radium, which at that time was considered very healthful. Some owners tried to bottle and sell the waters. Our older lady on the left-hand side is clearly enjoying the cooler temperatures around the spring, but her umbrella indicates that it's still nonetheless pretty hot in July in Arizona. Later on, and in the 1920s, as the attraction of a health resort began to wane in Arizona and the Southwest, Agua Caliente owners became more interested in private development. The Drachman family, a well-known real estate developing family in Tucson, tried twice, first in 1900 and again in 1920, to assemble a suitable investment group to buy and develop Agua Caliente into a premier resort. Alas, that effort failed. Willard White was the next owner of the property. What you've got in front of you right now is an aerial photograph, our first aerial photograph of the Tucson Basin. You can see, if I can find, there's the cursor, the extent of the agricultural fields to the north. Here is the original pond and the swimming pond down below. Here is the original ranch house, the irrigation pond that fed the agricultural fields. Here is the orange orchard that's probably being replanted now that it's 50 years on. And here, Willard White established a date palm grove. And we'll see many of these features in a better image a little bit later on. But this gives you an overview of the extent of the development that all of these owners had invested in this particular place and time. Willard White was probably the man who did most of the historic design landscape that's available at Agua Caliente today. Oops, excuse me. He took, this is the channel without those fan palms surrounding it, and he developed an entrance way for his automobile that came in and ended in a loop in front of the ranch house, which you see here. He planted these fan palms as an allée to emphasize the grandeur of that entrance that he had constructed. Here you can see his ranch house and the turning circle in front of the ranch house, which was planted with different kinds of cacti. Here is the island again with a new bridge that he probably constructed at that time. There it is. As you can see in this photograph, which was taken about 30 years later in 1950, there are very few fan palms that surround the pond. Keep that in mind as we go through the rest of our photographs. And here is his date palm grove. Now those trees are upwards of 30 or 40 feet in height. In 1951, the Art Filiatro and his family purchased Agua Caliente. They were the last of the private families to own the ranch, and it was being run as a cattle ranch at that time. Filiatro built the pool that you see and really upped the game from Willard White's development. Alas, oh, and here you can see the extent of that development right before the ranch was sold to a developer. And here you can see there's the ranch house compound right here, This is the ranching operations over on this side. Here you can see the date palm grove. Here's the main pond, the swimming pond. Here's the orange orchard. And the agricultural fields, even at this time, are beginning to revert to native vegetation. Here's the irrigation pond that fed both that orange grove and the last of the agricultural fields. You can see off and down below the main ponds a series of holding ponds. Oops, let me go back. A series of holding ponds that kept excess water from the springs on the property. In 1959, you can see that the surrounding desert has had very little development. There are a few roads, but primarily it's open desert in around the environment. In 59, it was sold, the property was sold to Myriad Development Corporation. And they planned to take this property and put on the 100 acres in the center part around 80 houses. Fortunately, they were unsuccessful in obtaining a development plan approval from the county. But you can see that they have expanded the 2 ponds into 1 and redeveloped the embankment to make it stronger and more sturdy. They've expanded the irrigation pond and clearly we're intending to develop houses around that extension. The little dots that you see here are transplanted fan palm trees. Myriad, alas, never got its permit, but held on to the property for over 20 years and did little to manage or maintain the property. You can see that the date palm grove is not being watered properly. The orange orchard is beginning to dissipate and die. At 20 years, Myriad sold the property, since it couldn't make any profit off of it, to a second developer named Godecki Company. Godecki had grand visions just like Myriad. They took the lower ponds, which you can see off here to the left, and expanded those lower ponds. For those of you, perhaps older viewers of this talk, you might remember a television show that Godecki named his property after. This was going to be called Fantasy Island Development. And you can see his fantasy islands over here and over here. He may have had great fantasies, but he, like Myriad, did not pay much attention to taking care of the landscape. The ponds are being filled in with reeds. The irrigation pond over here has had a major failure and collapsed. The date palm grove is in its last legs. Fortunately, we had help from Roy Drachman, a well-known Tucson philanthropist and descendant of the original real estate planner, who gave Pima County a significant sum of money to acquire the property in 1984. It was in terrible condition, as you saw in the last slide. Broken windows, broken plumbing lines, overgrown ponds, and not not very attractive at the time. Pima County envisioned a natural park for Agua Caliente. Nonetheless, they wanted a formal design plan for its quote-unquote natural park. And that's what you see in front of you. I know it's hard to read, but essentially what you're looking at is a recreation of the now famous Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum that was built on the west side of Tucson. It's the same idea, a rabbit warren of ecological sites and stations to showcase wetlands, riparian areas, archaeological demonstration areas, native plant species areas. The property was going to host upwards of 250 parking spaces, just like the Sonoran Desert Museum, and all of the historic structures were slated for demolition. Alas, while the Board of Supervisors loved that plan, the design was roundly condemned by the community for its failure to incorporate their historic structures and the historic landscape. Without an approved plan, the park again went into dormancy. Buildings and features like the house and pool fell into further disrepair. 5 years later, in 1993, the county threatened to demolish all of the aging buildings, but again, the neighborhood rose up and to challenge that threat of demolition. Enter our hero, Pete Filiatro, who had grown up at Agua Caliente in the 1950s. With Pete at the head of the challenge, he led a small cadre of neighborhood activists and formed the Friends of Agua Caliente. With the support of the State Historic Preservation Office, they persuaded the Board of Supervisors to preserve at least 3 of the 4 remaining buildings. In conjunction with the Friends of Agua Caliente, a second master plan for the park was developed. This one both celebrated the buildings, which you can still see here. It celebrated Willard White's entry design. It retained many of those stalwart date palms and the palm alley that aligned the entrance road, and kept the main pond pretty much in its historic conditions. It reduced the amount of parking to something on the order of 70 or 80 parking spaces instead of the 250. And this is the plan that we see today. Here is the new entrance road. Here is the caretaker's building, which has been turned into the education center at the park. Here is the historic ranch house, which is now the main visitor contact station, and a local art gallery. So just when we think everything is good and everybody is happy, the same tension over differing values of the cultural and the natural arises again in 2000. The Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan was and is a nationally recognized conservation plan that guides the regional development in the Tucson Basin. It was approved by the Board of Supervisors, Pima County Board of Supervisors, in 2000. A major intent of the plan was to protect both important cultural and ecological resources. And Agua Caliente, in the circle there, was a highlight that had both of those values. Growth and development in Pima County had degraded many of the riparian corridors and threatened a number of endangered species in the basin. The Board of Supervisors charged the county departments to develop a plan to restore Tucson's riparian environments. County Flood Control immediately looked at Agua Caliente, a county property, which was important, with a substantial water flow for restoration possibilities. Clearly, this landscape needed restoring. You can see all of the overgrown and introduced fan palms. The pond was full of bulrushes, cattails, and the dreaded bullfrog, along with other introduced goldfish that people liked to drop into the pond when they didn't want them. The Army Corps of Engineers offered to fund a feasibility study to restore the park, and then even to pay for the restoration of the park itself. Scientists hired by the county had stated that the area would support many of those threatened species. They suggested that restoration of the site could go a long way in the recovery of those species in the Tucson Basin. The Army Corps of Alternatives offered to leave the main pond intact, but surround it with a 4-foot wall to keep the bullfrogs out. All of the other ponds and wetlands would be regraded to create a 10-acre ciénaga, or marshland, that would support native fish, amphibians, and reptiles. This was the vision that you would have of a 4-foot wall around the pond to keep the frogs out, but it was challenging when people came to have weddings, all sorts of ceremonies at Agua Caliente. That proposed wall would really challenge the whole notion of that visual and aesthetic and historic feelings of the pond's surrounding landscape. As a result, the Friends group rose up again and led the neighborhood to reject the Army Corps of Engineers feasibility study. They just did not believe that the pond needed improvement. They didn't want to threaten the historic nature, and as a consequence, they began to document a lot of the features that we now know today as the historic landscape at Agua Caliente. Beyond the mistrust, the general mistrust of federal agencies, the major conflict that occurred in this event again involved the lack of recognition of alternative values for traditional and historic resources. The county, fortunately, decided to drop this plan. It didn't want to have the idea of restoration being challenged by the Agua Caliente Friends. Unfortunately, that plan moved elsewhere, and Agua Caliente was left pretty much on its own for a number of years afterwards. Of course, nothing stays the same. We can now show that there was actually a happy ending to this story, a challenged ending, but a happy ending nonetheless. Mother Nature, who always has the last word, finally brought these two warring parties, the county and the Friends group, together. In 2001, Arizona and the Southwest, as you all know, entered into what now appears to be a very long drought cycle. This multi-decadal drought has slowed and now finally stopped the spring flow for the first time in recorded memory. Because of the insufficient flow to the ponds, the county decided to drill a well nearby, at least to provide some water to Pond 1. But even with this continuous pumping, only a small water was able to remain in Pond 1. Facing this imminent loss of the centerpiece of this community, the Friends and the county came together to craft a drastic solution. Essentially, a recreation of both Ponds 1 and 2. The county has invested large amounts of funds to line and rebuild both of the ponds. The agreement gave the county the opportunity to remove invasive animals, reduce the bulrushes and fan palms that crowded out the native species, and to reduce the loss of water through the bottoms of the ponds. The agreement has largely preserved the main pond and its historic design landscape for the Friends group. The county and the Friends, now with common perceptions of this particular challenge, are now working together on a common solution in order to maintain both the natural and the historic resources of this special place for its community. Both sides have had to recognize those differing values that each other holds in order to protect what is now seen as their own common good.